representative from Pennsylvania. Okay, Matt Ferentz, your representative for PA House District 6, an educator, a man with amazing facial hair, lots to say on public education, how we can be healthy, how we can be green, and actually rewriting the story of Northwest PA. So I'm going to bring him in right now. There he is. And then I'm going to hand it over to him, and it's all yours, Matt.
Thanks, Jason. And thanks, everybody, for clicking in here as we're using this new technology so that we can have multiple people on the screen at the same time, which is nice, and broadcasting simultaneously on Facebook Live and YouTube channel live. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give an address for about 15 minutes and then open up to comments. And you can put comments in the feed wherever you're watching from. We also had a few that were mailed in or emailed in, and I'll get to answering those questions, and we'll go from there. So as I said, my name's Matt Ferentz, and I'm running to be the representative for Legislative District 6 in the Pennsylvania House. There's a phrase that I often use in explaining the core of my campaign, and that's that we live the stories that we tell and the stories that people tell about us. I am a writer by training and a teacher of writing and literature, so it comes as no surprise that I believe in the power of story. But tonight, I want to emphasize how much the stories that circulate in and within our lives dictate how we see the world around us, and how those stories have tremendous impact on the legislation and the economy that our elected officials value and champion. So tonight, I want to talk about the economy and economic unfairness in Northwestern Pennsylvania. What we don't talk about enough is how persistent stories lock us into a rough economic reality. So we have pride in our region, and that's right, and we should, because we're the birthplace of the zipper, and we're a place with a tremendous capacity of tool and die shops and a long heritage in farming, and one of the oldest colleges in the United States. But we also understand that times have been tough here for a long time. We need to talk more about how our economic condition, that of struggle and of precarity, has been built around certain expectations of story, not necessarily our stories, and how those conditions continue to prevail very much because legislators and career politicians are perfectly happy with the status quo that keeps us exactly where we are, which is broke. This is what we need to recognize. First of all, 13.5% of the residents of Crawford County live below the poverty line, and that is higher than the Commonwealth average. 24% of the residents of Meadville live below the poverty line, and that is twice the Commonwealth average. Crawford County ranks 56th out of 67 Pennsylvania counties in per capita income, 56th out of 67, and 43rd in poverty. Erie County fares better, but it's still very much in the middle of the pack. So when you look at each of these benchmarks, what you see is that the real story is one of perpetual economic difficulty. We are not prospering, and many of our neighbors are struggling to pay their bills, or afford visits to their doctors, or put food on the table, or find jobs that pay fair, sustainable, livable wages. And it's not getting better. If you're lucky enough to have health care from your employer, for example, you know that your own personal cost share keeps going up, even as your income doesn't. And you know that our schools are suffering from perpetual funding problems. And you know that our infrastructure, roads and sewers and bridges, are struggling. They're rough. And while you might hear from career politicians that we can't possibly raise wages because that would hurt the economy, and that schools just aren't budgeting the right way, and that public investment isn't worthwhile, we also know that our municipalities are struggling with depressed tax bases, and our schools are not overfunded, and our teachers are certainly not underworked, and that it is very hard to raise a family on the kind of wages that are often on offer in our district. For example, hourly wage workers often have to take overtime to make ends meet. Some workers have to toil 60 or 70 hours a week just to make the money of a fairly paid full-time job. And in that situation, you also have to consider yourself lucky to have that job because so many of our neighbors are also out of work. One of the worst dynamics of the economic story we live is that so many Pennsylvanians are being exploited for their labor, and then they're being told to be grateful for that. I grew up in Indiana County, born in 1975, as the coal mines that had been the industrial center of that town were shutting down. Still, the frequent refrain from so many politicians during my childhood, and even now, is to campaign on bringing back coal or some other variation of an imaginary faith in long gone good old days that, truth be told, also came with a large measure of black lung and crushed limbs, and an ethos that considers the bodies of miners as tools to be spent and discarded, not as people who deserve the right to live prosperous, safe, and satisfying lives. We are told over and over again that if we give ourselves to industry, they will pay us a wage, almost enough to live on. Politicians who spun and spin those stories won and continue to win elections because they pitch what so many want to hear, that we will be rewarded for our hard work. The mines in my hometown stayed closed, of course, or a couple reopened as low-wage non-union mines, and miners took those bad jobs because they had no other options. More recently, I've seen the Marcellus gas boom back at home and up here in Northwestern Pennsylvania, and that brought some jobs for a bit, but mostly it brought wealth to wealthy people, with many of the drilling jobs given to workers brought in from out of state. Then wellhead prices crashed from overproduction, so the work disappeared for even the lucky few that had it, and the promised economic benefit to our stores, our schools, our communities, well, that also vanished. This is the story of our region. Since pretty much forever, every promised boom has come with a bust, and the only people getting wealthy on the booms are not us. Remember when Oil City and Titusville were some of the wealthiest places in America? Remember what happened when the oil boom ended. You would think then that these persistent cycles of economic struggle would inspire politicians to seek new solutions to persistent problems. Instead, we see the Commonwealth voting to give an estimated $1.5 billion tax break to build an ethylene cracker plant in the Ohio Valley, which would lead to something like an estimated 600 permanent jobs. 600 permanent jobs after construction. And just this month, the legislature overwhelmingly passed a new $670 million tax break to lure even more petrochemical companies to Pennsylvania for another estimated 600 permanent jobs. That's $2 billion for 1,200 jobs, or about $1.7 million in tax relief to the companies building the plants for each permanent job. That doesn't seem like a good deal for workers or for taxpayers. And here's another part most politicians don't like to talk about. When you start adding up the economic cost of things like pollution cleanup and additional health care because of the pollution, fossil fuel development is not profitable. It is only profitable for the companies that run the plants because we pay for it in the form of tax breaks, in tax dollars spent cleaning up the pollution left behind, and in the increased healthcare premiums and co-pays that we cough up. So why do we see this happening? because it's the story of the economy. Number one, that fossil energy extraction is the only thing that can change the fortunes of our region, even though we've seen time and again that it does not for most people who live in a place where fossil resources are the backbone of an economy. And that people, this is number two, people like us who live in the industrial portions of the state exist only to grow the wealth of corporations. What I have never, ever understood, and what I am literally running for office against, is politicians who claim to be representing their communities by voting for, supporting, and championing bad deals like this. But that too is the long story of our region. Career politicians are fine with the status quo, even when it harms the people in the area, because they are not affected by the status quo. And it is a lot more work standing up against exploitation than it is collecting a paycheck that is 4 times the per capita income of Crawford County and enjoying your state-sponsored health care and tax-funded retirement fund. One more number, $4.5 million. That's the estimated total cost of a representative's taxpayer-funded salary, his staff salaries, all of their benefits, travel costs, office leases for a person who has been in office since, say, 2008. That's a lot of money. I would ask, what have Crawford and Erie County seen in return for that investment? And I don't mean that in the sense of pork barrel jobs, because that's just another unethical way to run an economy. I mean, what kind of actual support for a new economy have we seen? 56th in per capita income, 43rd in poverty. That's what we have seen. What I would like to see is a reinvestment in workers as people and not just as profit lines on a spreadsheet. I would like to see an economy focused on our lives instead of our profit potential. And I would like to see a recognition that the bad choices we are always given are not the only choices possible. This is where I see tremendous possibility in green industrial development. Look, we are good at making stuff in Northwestern Pennsylvania. We have the shops. And whether we're making stuff for gas wells or windmills, we can make it. And I would much rather see us invest in industries that will be sustainable for our economy and for our environment than to see state tax breaks go to companies that are simply looking for markets to subsidize their business models. These gas production deals we're seeing, they are nothing more than corporate welfare using our tax dollars to secure corporate profits. Let's think differently about gas production too, because there's no way around it. These deals are done. They are law. Gas will have to flow to support the tax investment. But what if we levied a renewable energy R&D requirement on all gas production? Just spitball it at, say, 20% of revenues. Say we made it so that chunk of change had to be invested in green R&D. And it could be invested by the company themselves, and they could keep what they invent, or it could be paid into a statewide fund that would be used for R&D for that development. This could be a way to actually use natural gas as a real bridge fuel, not just a bridge as in how we'll make money until we can't, which is what we're seeing right now, but as a bridge that provides the energy we do indeed need to heat our homes, but also uses the economic power of that energy to rapidly develop the new tech that can provide the energy in a sustainable way. The bonus part, our area industry can be retooled to support that new economic growth. And if we wind up leaving gas in the ground at the end of all this, that's a bonus too. I'll add in brief that we should choose also to invest in different sorts of economic growth. Sustainable small-scale agriculture has a great head start here. We should invest in growth there and getting more young and more diverse new farmers onto the land. The arts economy in the US is an $800 billion industry, bigger than construction, transportation, and mining. In Pennsylvania alone, there are more than 100,000 jobs supported by the arts. Imagine a city like Meadville, for example, where we have beautiful old TLC-ready, low-cost housing stock that young artists could renovate and use to make new homes and a new economy. Imagine more arts development in Erie County and how the lake can continue to be an inspiration for beauty and meaningfulness. Budgets tell you who a commonwealth cares about. What and who we choose to invest our money in is really just another story. I'm running for office because we need bolder, smarter vision to speak for the people of Northwestern Pennsylvania. We don't have to accept tired political inaction and call it a day. We deserve better than reps who literally run on legacies of doing very little. Why can't we think differently about what counts as an economy? Why can't we fight to develop these new sectors and invest in those? We have foundations for this kind of development in our district, and we can do more if we commit to different, more sustaining vision of who we can be. Disrupting the rigged economy that makes us suffer and that is used to make us blame each other for our design suffering is the umbrella of my campaign. In other town halls, I'll talk in more detail about the 3 planks of my platform: healthcare, education, environmental conservation. Working toward economic fairness is at the heart of all 3 of these. So in brief, healthcare reform gives us a way to keep more dollars in workers' pockets and let them choose more easily where they want to work or if they want to start their own businesses. Education from pre-K through high school, college, and ongoing worker education and training gives people the tools to shape their working lives and earn enough money to support their families and live good lives. Environmental conservation saves money and keeps us healthier because pollution is expensive and so is sickness. Plus, in Northwestern PA, so many of us have a shared love for our woods and waters, whether as hunters, hikers, fishers, boaters, joggers, photographers, or people who just enjoy living in a quiet, clean part of the country. It's time to stop forcing all of us to make a choice between living well and having a job. That's really no choice at all. It's extortion. We keep being fed the same story over and over. And in politics, part of the story is that somehow a party is more important than the actions of people representing that party or representing us. I don't care about your party, and I hope you don't care about mine. I'm running for office because I care about us and about this part of the country that my children will always call home. And because I have spent my life in Western Pennsylvania seeing bad politics worsen our difficult economic condition. We can do better. We have to, and we will. All right, bring Jason back on and take to some questions.
All right, that was fantastic, Matt. Just in summary, one of the first questions that we got was, given your educational and professional background, what makes you an expert in economics, and in particular, economic unfairness in Crawford County? And obviously, that's a good chunk of what you just talked about. But for the people that are maybe just joining us, how about we give them a quick summary from you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm going to fold that back into the idea of story. So I am not an economist, and there are very few politicians who are economists. And so what we have to think about is how often the language of economy is being used to pretend that it's something objective. These are the false choices I'm talking about, that we have to do this job and develop the economy in this way, or there's nothing else. That is based on a belief in a story. So my training and background as a teacher, writer, and academic is in Appalachian history and culture. And what you see when you look back through hundreds of years is that that's been a tool that has always been used to exploit the people who are producing the wealth for the rest of the country. So for me, a lot of recognizing economic unfairness is learning to read the story that's actually being told by the numbers. And then the other part is I'm smart enough to know what I don't know. And in order to figure out the answers to these questions, we have to listen to the experts who are the economists, who are running the numbers and can tell us how we can make these different choices.
Great. So we're going to pop a comment in here. from Dimitru, and he said, talking about creating financial incentives for ethical business practices. Do you have maybe some thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I agree. And I think this is exactly right, is that, and I don't necessarily mean this as a criticism of business. It's just the way business and capitalism works, is that it's not about ethics. It's about profit. And one of the tools that we see are, so if we think about that cracker plant I referenced, is that the state is investing money to get an outcome. And the reason the companies are going to build the petrochemical plants is because they have a financial interest in doing it. The choice, I think, can be different from the legislative end. We don't actually have to invest in that. We can use the financial incentives to grow the other businesses. And that's where I see the green industrial development happening. We can have taxpayer support, or some of the stuff I'm talking about using funds from gas well extractions. But it's absolutely right. I mean, we have to find ways that make it so companies want to do what is productive for our economy.
Of course, yeah. So Rebecca asked how your economic plan is going to impact small business owners. Obviously, in this area, especially at this time, this is something that everybody in this county is really interested in. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And so those small businesses run everywhere from a single proprietor shop all the way up to some of the larger tool and die shops that we have in the area. And I think we need to think about it in those terms. We need to make sure that they have work in a certain way. And so that's part of that reinvestment in green tech. If we're inventing essentially a new industry where we start building, that's going to provide a marketplace for our tool shops if we start there. And the tool shops are ready to do it. And they can build whatever a client needs to build. And so if we are bringing it in that way for green development, bottom line, it doesn't make any difference. Long term, I think it makes a much bigger difference, because we wind up not being tied to boom bust cycles of some of these industries, so they have a more sustainable business model. To me, that keeps trickling down. I hate that phrase. I hate that I just used that phrase because trickle down economics really are more trickle down pain. But that other businesses in the area benefit from that increased revenue across the sector. I'll talk more in detail about this another time with healthcare, but small business owners would be one of the greatest beneficiaries of a different way of offering healthcare in Pennsylvania. There's been a bill that's been in front of the legislature for a decade that would have individual contributions for healthcare at 3% of your income, and for businesses 10% of their income. That's a massive reduction of cost for most employers, the vast majority of employers, and the vast majority of individuals. That helps small businesses in big ways, because first of all, they can control costs for the healthcare they offer for even the one person working in their shop, because it wouldn't actually be offered by them. And small businesses could compete because they wouldn't have to try to convince someone to take a job without healthcare to compete against a big company that does offer it. And so I think that kind of redevelopment starts to wash around in lots of different ways.
Sure. Lindsay Scott has a couple comments here. I think really most of them deal with labels. I think you talked about this a little bit over the weekend. Labels such as most of us being middle class, and things that get maybe mislabeled as socialism, that are put out there by different candidates or parties and propaganda and things like that. If you want to talk about like SNAP and healthcare exchanges and a little bit about that, Lindsay would be very interested.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, so starting with healthcare itself, one of the first things I would say is that most of us pay an enormous unrepresented tax, which is healthcare, because we are if you want to actually be able to afford healthcare, you have insurance and you're paying for it, but those are decisions that are made by companies and not by representative government. And that's a way of thinking about socialism, right, in the big quotes, versus not, is that's actually a governmental protection for private insurance companies who have a guaranteed income from us because we're the market, our health is the market, instead of allowing the government to collectively use our purchasing power to have the health exchanges. There's actually no functional difference of that other than the more people you get in the pool, the more cost effective it is to have the health care. So there's a socialism involved in both ways. The other thing is I'll go back to this idea of petrochemical companies. When you actually do the accounting fully, you realize that, you know, people will say green technology can't work because it's not profitable. But when you do the accounting properly and include all the costs that we pay, it's not profitable to run the fossil fuel industry. An example of that is there are millions and millions of dollars of liability sitting in the woods across Pennsylvania in the form of uncapped gas wells. There's a socialism, right, in the bad term of this, a corporate welfare to this, that companies just abandoned them. And these are leaking methane constantly. And the DEP is going around and spending our taxpayer money to cap those. And when the state tried to get industry to put into escrow the amount it would cost to cap a well, and every well is eventually going to need to be capped, into escrow to cover that, they said that there's no way. Just trust us. We'll pay for it when the time comes. That's what we have. That's the lie that Lindsay's talking about here, is that lots of taxpayer aid is going to big companies. And as soon as it starts helping regular people, that's when the politicians start saying it's bad.
Great. We're just popping a couple of those comments up. Thanks for your comment, Jeannie, out there. So let's talk about, on that same vein, can you give some specifics about how you're going to serve the district rather than fighting these ideological battles that aren't helping anybody?
Yeah, that is a really good question, because what Pennsylvania, I think, is infamous for partisan battles in Harrisburg. And we have seen it right now, that as soon as the coronavirus crisis hit, we entered immediately into a partisan battle over what should be done versus what shouldn't be done, instead of asking questions about what we need. And so I think I'm walking the long way around to the answer to this question. It's on brand for me. Is that so? What we saw was pitting public health versus the economy, so to speak. But what we actually had was a refusal to recognize that those two things are deeply intertwined. And instead of having a legislation that recognized, or a legislature that recognized that this is a health crisis, and that forcing people to go back into work in a health crisis is not good for their health, nor is it good for the economy, we just wound up with partisan bickering. I would be a representative who would fight for actually beginning with a statement of the problem, which is what I don't see many politicians doing. They come in with the answer that they want, which is a partisan answer, and then they find evidence to back up that partisan idea. I think we need to take that step back and gather our information and respond to that, and look at what all of our possible options could be. That will make me deeply popular, I'm sure, with all of my legislative colleagues. But I think it's what we need to do to break that divide. Because at the end of the day, whether we're a Republican or a Democrat, if you can't afford to pay for your health care, you can't afford to buy food for your family, that hurts. I'll say in another part of this is that people who are talking about how they're being hurt economically by the coronavirus situation are right. They're not wrong. They actually are suffering. It's that the partisans have made it so that happened, that suffering is part of the design so that they can win political points instead of actually alleviate suffering. And the state would have the resources to simultaneously keep people healthy and keep them fed.
All right. Well, you took the words right out of my mouth, because I was going to say, speaking of political bickering, we had a question about the state's COVID response, and obviously something that is on all of our minds, and its effect on our local economy, and possibly what you would have maybe suggested we do differently, and maybe some of the things that we did right.
Yeah, and I will say, I think that the governor, particularly early on, made a lot of good decisions about responding to the growing numbers of cases to keep us protected and home. And so when you look at our illness curve, it's much better than a lot of other places. But we're starting, like a lot of other places, to creep back up. What's bothered me about the state response is that pretty much literally the day that bars and restaurants were closed, we had members of the majority who were already calling for it to end. And they've continued to spend the entire shutdown putting bill after bill in front of the legislature that actually doesn't help workers, and it doesn't help improve the healthcare. So like an example, there was one bill that came across, which at face value is a fine bill, and it would be to have allowed a store to be open with one employee and have one customer at a time. On the face, that's fine, except to pretend that that is going to actually solve the economic problems for a business owner, it is a distortion at best, because you're not going to be able to offer enough with that kind of business model to have the same kind of revenue you normally would have. And what I see with that political response, and I think, I'm going to not say what I was about to say, but with that political response, what you see is that the state has abdicated its responsibility to help people make the decisions that are best. Instead, they've used the language of liberty and the language of personal freedom to put all the risk on the individual. And that's what we've seen with the mask issues that we have. And that's what we're also seeing with school districts right now. So school districts are trying to figure out, can we or how do we open up in the fall? And what we know is that if the school districts don't open, that's going to be difficult for the economy. But what we're not seeing are ways that the state might say, well, we can help protect the economy if you make the right health decision. There was a fantastic open letter from a school superintendent actually in Vermont the other day. And Vermont's done quite well. It's a small state, but they've done very well with the COVID response. And that superintendent said the problem is that in their state, and I think Pennsylvania is the same way, the legislature has said, we leave it to you, school districts, to make the right decision. But they can't make the right decision because they don't have the resources and finances to actually lay all the options on the table. So instead of being an answer to the problem, the state legislation pretends that they're giving power back to the people, but are actually forcing local business owners, municipalities, school districts to make decisions that are kind of preset choices. That's what needed to be done differently.
All right. Tanya Reed sent us a comment, and she was saying with the, I'll pop it in here, with the tight federal regulations on things like commercial meat production, what can we do to bring a focus back to agriculture in our area and promote small scale farm growth?
Yeah, I love this. We have so many small farmers of all kinds of different philosophical backgrounds who are producing local produce, local meat, local mushrooms, and we have wonderful members of the restaurant community that are using those. And we have a model in the Meadville Market House of the way things used to be done, right? I don't mean this to sound super nostalgic, but we have the capacity to create regional centers that bring farmers together with the consumers of the products. I actually think that we could do a lot more with state incentives for building those sorts of networks so that we could be getting more of our proteins, more of our produce from the farmers who we actually are meeting at the farmers market or actually going to the farm gate to make these purchases. Again, this is a situation where that economy of scale and legislation since the 1950s has favored a large agribusiness model that in fact gets farmers into debt so they can't get out of agribusiness. If you're looking at some of the big tractors that farmers have to have, they're six-figure purchases.
Oh, super expensive, yeah.
And the only way you can pay the overhead on that is to continue farming more and more acreage, which means you need more and more of these machines. And so many family farms wind up being bought out by corporate farms because they just can't compete with that. We can bend that back. It's one of the advantages of being a small county or small two counties is that it wouldn't be that difficult for us to create an infrastructure where that became a more central part of how we got our food. Plus more new farmers.
Yeah, more new farmers is always good. So let's pivot over to workers' rights. So Kevin Scott sent us a comment, and Pennsylvania, he says, has very few workers' rights, and people are seeing this more than now more than ever with the pandemic. So do you support, pushing for more rights, or do you agree with the hands-off right to work approach that, we've had for so long in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so the so-called right to work legislation that pushes through is misnamed. That it really should be called right to exploit. So much of what has built the industrial success of Pennsylvania in the past were strong unions and strong workers' rights. The fact that the workers of any company could stand together and get a fair shake for wages and safety. Two violent moments in our nation's history were workers' strikes. One was the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia, which was coal miners' strike, and the other is the Homestead Steelworks in Pittsburgh. And that's where workers stood up and said, hey, I actually don't think that this is fair, that we are losing our lives for bad wages. And the response was to actually come in with guns and put down the battles. So I am 100% in support of workers' protections. What we're seeing right now, again, like I'm talking about COVID because it's a good example. COVID is a great lens for the problems that we face and have been facing. As soon as we started having this language of ending unemployment or reopening the business, this is actually a coded way to take away workers' rights. Because if you can work because your business is open, but you choose not to, suddenly you don't have the choice to say no. You can't get unemployment. And you can get fired if you don't show up. We're seeing sectors, including my own sector, the education sector, are trying to get immunity from legal immunity if workers get sick from COVID-19. Again, to take away the workers' rights to stay safe or make choices, but to put them back. So I would never want to see Pennsylvania formally become a right to work state. That's been held off officially for a long time. But Kevin's exactly right that in effect, a lot of places are operating as non-union shops and the unions don't have a chance to get in. I'll also say, if you do some reading and history work on labor unions, you'll find that companies spend an enormous, and I'm not saying companies in Crawford County are doing this, but large corporations spend enormous amounts of money hiring firms to come in and squash worker rights. And so there's a really good documentary, I can't remember the name of it right now, about Youngstown and the steel plants. And there was a new plant came in, and the workers were starting to talk about unionizing because they had been union members when it had been a Ford plant. And so then the company hired this firm to come in and have mandatory paid meetings to explain to them why unions weren't in their best interest. They spend millions of dollars to keep workers from having rights, and we need to ask the question of why. We need workers to band together so that they get the fair shake.
Sure, and you're seeing that, something that's very popular in this area when you look at sports right now is the same thing. You have at least with the NFL, the opt-out clause that's being put out there. Basically, you can take a very small fraction of the salary that you're doing, but once again, you have those owners that this is their whole revenue stream. So we still might look at those sports players and say, well, they make millions of dollars, they can afford it, and things like that. But they're making a health decision, and they have basically their bosses pushing back against it.
Yeah, and they're in a different situation than most of us, obviously,
Yeah,
because they've got the money in the bank, they can resist. What I would say as part of the design of paying barely livable wages broadly is if you keep workers close enough to disaster, and this is part of why I don't think we have single-payer healthcare too. If you keep workers close enough to health disaster, they can't make a choice to vote with their feet because you can't quit that job if you have to worry about you or someone you love getting sick. Or you're just, how am I going to pay for it if I quit this job? So I'm going to take the bad deal that's offered.
Yeah, and you've talked about that a couple times, and I think that if you did a quick poll in our area, I know, but probably across the state, is that very thing. Whether it's that you're taking the bad situation because of benefits, or you're taking the bad situation because you can't afford not to.
Right. Yeah.
And so
many of our kids, and I mean, I think this will resonate with a lot of people here, is that like you have to get out, right? Like this is the narrative or the story that if you want to make a good wage, you have to leave home and go do it somewhere else. We shouldn't be setting it up that way. Why are we chasing our children away from the places where they grew up because there's not economic development? That's not sustainable for a region.
Absolutely. Gretchen sent a comment in and wanted to know, with the current agenda around the current ACA healthcare program, what would your approach be to turning that around and offering more public healthcare?
Yeah. So I think both because of that and in general, I actually think that single payer healthcare is going to have to be a state level solution instead of a federal level solution. That there's no reason why Pennsylvania could not pass the bill. It's called the PA Healthcare for All bill. We would be the only state in the United States to have it, which I actually think would be a competitive advantage for us in business. But what we're seeing with all of the battling in Washington, as legislators in Pennsylvania, I'll say we, projecting into the future, we as legislators, or if I were a legislator, to fight for Pennsylvanians because we know the federal government's not going to provide it. We actually have a big enough population of 13 million people that we could do it ourselves as a Commonwealth. Even if we get to a place where the conversation changes in Washington, I think it's more than likely we'll see that the implementation is going to have to be at the state level. And this was the way it was with the ACA as well, is that a lot of it was federal incentives and federal assistance for states to create their own exchanges. And that's part of the nature of how we are. So that's what that's what I would do. That's how I see it working here, is that bill needs to get out of the healthcare committee, which hasn't happened in a decade. And it needs to have a fair hearing from legislators and from the people of Pennsylvania to actually take a look at the numbers and see whether that's something that they would actually favor. And I know for me, my family would save somewhere in the neighborhood of $7,000 a year and have better health care than we have right now with the bill that's been proposed.
I love the option that this platform has to pop in the comments from and everything. I feel it's like the rising tide of comments. As they get longer, we have to sit up straighter in our chairs so that you can still see us over them. So Demetra wrote in again and asked, what could be done, what practical steps could be taken to arrest the rise of violence against minorities and African Americans, LGBTQ plus people and immigrants in our communities. A little off topic, he said, but I think that coming from our, hopefully future state representative, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, and I'll always say very few things are actually off topic because so many things are deeply entwined. And that if we become a place that is known for being intolerant, that has an economic impact. That's not the reason we should be tolerant. Tolerance is not about economics. It's about righteousness and being good human beings, but that it actually connects to economy. So it's a really good question, and it's a really hard answer because it's almost impossible to legislate goodness, right? But what I will say is what we have seen nationally and in the Commonwealth itself is that politicians are really good at using language that invigorates the fascists, the neo-Nazis, the anti-trans community. I don't want to call them a community, the anti-trans people. They get cover because they see their representatives and their senators, their president, saying it's okay, essentially. As much as in the United States, we have a healthy suspicion of politicians, which I think is a good thing. Like, that is part and parcel to who we are as a people. We should always be suspicious of them. They're also public figures whose speech deeply impacts our decision making. We saw this like last week when the president finally said wearing a mask is a good idea. The approval rating of mask wearing among Republicans went through the roof. So we have to recognize that playing with fire that way is going to ignite it. And with the protests we're seeing across the country right now, we're seeing that they're not just playing with that fire, they're adding fuel to it and using it as a political tool. So that's part of the answer. That's not as satisfying. I wish I had something more like, here's practical steps forward. I mean, I am in favor of statewide and local anti-discrimination clauses. There's no reason why we shouldn't pass them. There's been some progress with that at the state level, but we need to protect the civil rights of all Americans, and all of those categories fall into that.
All right. As we come to the end of this town hall tonight, we want to remind you all out there listening, get your last questions in, and Matt will be happy to answer them. One of the ones that had been sent in earlier was about how you plan to ensure more equitable funding across school districts, which I think is a great question, especially now looking at possibly a lot more remote learning and the opportunities that are available to different districts and things like that.
Yeah. So we've got a inherently unfair way of funding public education in Pennsylvania, and that's that we're funding it in large portion by local property taxes. And the obvious result of that is that the less money that a place has, so the less tax revenue a place has, the more difficult it is for them to have the revenues for a strongly supported school district. Now, the interesting thing about District 6 is we can see the difference between what that means. The northern part of the district in Fairview Township has one of the strongest school districts in the state, and a state and a community that supports the funding. They also have a much higher income than the rest of the district. From the rest of the district struggles because the tax base isn't there. So we have to find a way to share the expense statewide for funding. And this isn't new. Other places do this. It just means that places that don't want to share with others are going to have to start doing it. You mentioned, Jason, the what's happening with cyber, basically. And I think this is a fine example of it. So cyber schooling is a Trojan horse for the privatization of education in Pennsylvania. And not every school district has its own cyber school. Actually, many of them don't. So there are a few cyber charter schools. And the way that deal works is that there is a negotiated tuition that the school district will pay if a student chooses to use the PA Cyber or one of the other cyber schools. And so if you look at the expenditures in the state budgets in all of the Crawford County districts, they're all having to put away somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million a year to pay for students to go to these cyber schools. And if you look at Penncrest has their own cyber school. And if a student goes to one of the cyber charters, Penncrest has to pay something like $15,000 or $16,000, say, for that student to go there. Or maybe it's 12. But that's not what it costs for them to run their cyber school. So we have to recognize that these inequities are baked in. And when we pull a student out, if the expenditures are $16,000 for a student, and we pull them out and make them pay 12, they're actually losing a lot of money in that deal, because you still have to heat the school, you still have to have all the expenses. So statewide support for education, as far as a statewide pool for education dollars, and also looking at the sneaky ways that we're trying to ferret public money into private institutions.
Absolutely.
I saw that other question come up.
Oh yeah, I'll pop that back in.
Yeah, because I think it's actually really linked, both the school situation and the broader economic situation. Broadband access is the pits in rural Pennsylvania. So my parents, and this was like, we couldn't get cable television as kids, which was like ruining our lives. We just had 3 channels, and we were thrilled when we could get channel 53 from Pittsburgh, because we had like the super tall antenna up on a tower. But my parents only live 5 minutes from the town of Indiana. But for them to have high-speed broadband with a cable or cable television, they would have to pay the cost of running the cable to their house, which is like 5 figures. When we talk about expanded broadband access, we're only ever talking about it within this profit model where we incentivize companies that will make money. We actually need to think about it more like the Rural Electrification Project, where we understood that bringing electricity to rural homes would change the fortunes of the entire nation. We need to do the same thing for broadband access. that would create more equity in education with distance learning, which is going to be part of our lives, at least through this next school year, without a doubt. It would also open up the possibility of remote learning, remote work more so in this district. There are a lot of people who may have a job, even in, say, New York City, that might love living in rural Crawford County. If we had an infrastructure of high-speed broadband, why not, right? I've often thought this is that would be one of the greatest ways to bring new workers into the area. We don't, yeah, it's a utility. I saw that one pop up myself too. We use it as a utility. You can't get a job without internet. And so people that don't have it have to go to the public libraries, which also wind up being underfunded. And broadband's expensive. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but we pay a surprisingly high amount for a not that fast stream that we have to have. If it's a utility, we could actually run it so it becomes more equitable.
Yeah, well, and in this area, we have so few choices for it as well. So I think that we have some great opportunities here in town, such as Foundry Co-work, and the rise of co-working is all about that. If you could come here and live and have your job in New York City, and have it. But on the aspect of broadband, I actually know a gentleman out in Conneaut Lake, and the broadband runs to the end of his road. I mean, he is a quarter mile from the end of the cable, and he could pay to get it run, but it's thousands of dollars, and so his only other option is satellite, which is even more expensive than we pay for broadband. I mean, community rural broadband access would go a long way. I'm happy you mentioned Fairview. I had talked to a gentleman the other day whose kids go to Fairview, and he was just saying about how he couldn't imagine how all the students from the city schools were faring whenever they had to make the quick switch to remote learning, because his kids had been learning on iPads and Chromebooks and everything for years. So they basically just stayed at home. And not everybody obviously has those opportunities.
Right. Yeah. And I want to say, like, the teachers of the United States and the teachers of Pennsylvania did an amazing dance in moving from in-person teaching to online. But there are so many digital inequities that are from software to hardware to infrastructure that districts in many cases are doing the best they can, but it's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, a huge shout out to everybody in our district that kept students fed, and they kept pivoted real quick to remote learning and things. But the district can do only so much, whenever the options aren't there for things like broadband and technology from the schools.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, let's see. I know you have this giant big question waiting, for the end. If nobody else has any other questions, the question is, why should people vote for you? The obvious. What sets you apart from Brad Roy, and if elected, people can go back and look in the video what you've already told us in terms of healthcare, education, environment in our community. But so what sets you apart from Brad Roy?
Yeah, I think in some ways one of the things that maybe makes me the most annoying person to know is what sets me apart from Brad Roy, and might be a benefit, is that I read a ton and I will talk at length about issues. And I think the biggest difference between Brad Roy and me, and there's a lot of ideological differences. I don't think you could imagine two candidates who are more different than he is from me. But I think that I have an expansive sense of the world. I don't mean this in like a compliment myself, but I think about the world in an expansive way, and he thinks about the world in a smaller way. And so I grew up in Southwestern Pennsylvania, and then I lived in Arizona. I've spent time living in France, in Canada. I read constantly. I'm a researcher and a writer. And so anything that I approach, I'm coming at it from lots of different angles. Now, a credit to Brad Roy, which is part of the difference, is he is a remarkably consistent politician. Throughout his career, he's had the same basic platform, which is no taxes ever, and then defense of two essentially federal issues, which is no gun control and no abortions. Those latter two we could talk in great detail about, but he's been consistent about that. But that's a small vision of the status quo. I think we need to think in more expansive ways. And the big difference is that I'm going to approach every problem as a legislator this way, is that I'm going to read everything I can possibly find about it. I'm not going to take a message from whatever think tank the party is saying you should think about. And this is how a lot of politicians get their talking points. I'm actually going to do the research myself. And if it's something that isn't what my caucus would support, I'm still going to go for what is, in my view, best for Northwestern Pennsylvania and best for Pennsylvanians. And I think that's the biggest difference right there.
I think there's a lot to be said to how you've been very upfront in putting your thoughts out there on Facebook Live, on meeting with community members and things like that, more so than just jamming giant pieces of text into the comments area of battles on Facebook. So with that, we're a couple minutes over. If nobody else has any other questions, I want to thank Matt for having me on to hang out with you tonight as you told your story and why we should vote for you. And did we get a final question? Oh, what do you use for your incredible mustache?
Well, so I have, it's a really crucial question. So it takes two different products when you want to go on a curl day. I have a softer daily wax, which is a stronghold wax. And I'm not going to shout out any brand names because I don't want to advocate for them. But then there is a really strong, firm, largely beeswax that you have to do to get the hold on that swing. So
yeah,
maybe we'll do a whole event on mustache curling.
Yeah, now that I shaved mine off, I tried to get into the beard wax and stuff, and the biggest thing was just remembering to do it all the time.
Yeah.
To really condition it like that. So, but thank you everybody for being here and hanging with us as we, tried out this new platform, and you'll be doing more of these, right?
I will, absolutely. Yeah. Hoping to do at least several more, maybe every couple of weeks if people will have me. Appreciate everybody coming out tonight. You can check out more at I feel like one of the YouTubers my kids watch. Check out more at my website. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, but also feel free to shoot me an email. My email is just matt@electference.com. If you have a question we didn't cover today, there are some people who will tell you that those are even longer answers sometimes when you email me, but I'm happy to keep engaging as much as possible. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for coming in.